is Alan Craig. Uncle Sam wrote me a letter and invited me into military service back in 1968. I was there in 68 and 69. I had finished high school and taken a couple years at Nashville Auto Diesel College. Basic training was at Fort Sam Houston, Texas. I was a medic. I was a conscientious objector. And I took my basic and my AIT at Fort Sam Houston, Texas. When I left Fort Sam, they sent me directly to Vietnam. I got to come home for a few days before I left. It was just before Thanksgiving. My girlfriend, Janie Craig, took me to the airport, put me on a plane, and said goodbye. And as we was leaving, the plane had smoke come out of the cockpit, and we had to come back, and we got to go through that again. So I can't remember actually being fearful because I trusted in the Lord. We went on several patrol units. We had, I know one night I remember as a medic, we were back at the Forward LZ. I had a young man that was going home. His mother was dying of cancer, and he was assigned emergency leave. And he was in a bunker next to mine, and an incoming round came and hit directly in that bunker, and I had to put him in a body bag and set him home. I was a Seventh-day Adventist when I went in. I was a conscientious objector. Did not carry a weapon. On patrol at night, though, we did have to stand guard, and we set up claymore mines around our base. And my captain asked me, he said, "Now, would you hesitate to push this button on this claymore mine?" And I said, "Well, I'm here as a conscientious objector, but I said, I'm not also here to die." And I says, you know, I'll definitely, if I'm on patrol and someone comes up, I'm going to push the button. So that was just my personal reasoning. So.
My name is Andrew Boskind. I was in the United States Navy in the late 60s for 2 years. I was drafted in a special medical doctor's draft where they drafted 5,500 physicians specifically. I was at Camp Pendleton for a little over a year, and at which time I got hurry-up orders to go to Vietnam. And I was not theoretically supposed to go because I had less than a year left on my ticket, so to speak, but they sent me anyhow. When I left, it was a really hurry-up job. We were given orders one day that we were going to have to go, and within 48 hours we were gone. And so I didn't have a lot of time to be thinking, but I signed a bunch of papers giving everything to my wife. We didn't have anything, so it wasn't any big deal, but and the other thought foremost in my mind was I didn't know what to expect going to a war zone, and had some concerns about that. And when we arrived there, I got the first bitter inkling of what was to come. The plane that we came in on actually carried a bunch of caskets out. And my first sight as I was coming down the ramp of the plane was the caskets. And I knew I'd arrived and that this was for real. I think I was changed by a lot of these experiences in three different ways. One, I learned a lot about the overreaching command that politics has, and that we basically were pawns of people living in very comfortable places elsewhere. And number two, I learned that my men were terribly loyal. And would go out of their way to protect you and try to keep you out of harm's way. And I learned that we have an unbelievable country with freedoms of which most of us don't realize the cost of that. And finally, the old story that there are no atheists in foxholes, I think is true. Because when you see death and dying every day around you, you have nowhere to turn but God. And after I'd been there a while, I really came to a peace that I wasn't really concerned about things after that, except for my men who were mostly corpsmen, because we were a medical group, and every patrol that was sent out had to have corpsmen with them. And the enemy knew that, and they used to pick off our corpsmen first. And then the patrol had to abort and come back in. And so my corpsmen were just being killed right and left. And that was very difficult for me. I belonged to the Adventist Church during this entire time, and I was tested on a number of occasions personally, and I was tested for other people on many occasions, and I'll try to separate those out for you. Personally, I tried not to have any major duty or anything on Sabbath, and I managed that except with one colonel who one day on a Friday afternoon called up and said that we were going to have the clinic open on Saturday morning so the rest of the men could receive their immunizations or shots. And I indicated to him that we had sent out over his signature 6 different dates that those shots could be given, so the men, no matter what their excuses were, had plenty of time to pick one of those and actually come in and have it done. And that I had planned to go to church on Sabbath morning, and we had a few words, and he told me who he was, and I told him I understood who he was. And suffices to say, I went to church the next day. And as far as the other circumstance, the Marine Corps were not used to non-combatants. And during this time, the Marine Corps got in a draft situation in which quite a few young Adventist boys were caught up in the Marine Corps, and they did not know what to do with them. And when some of these guys stood up and wouldn't work on Sabbath and stuff, they were put in the brig. And somewhere somebody found out that there was an Adventist officer with them on base. And so I was asked to intervene on at least a half a dozen different occasions in which I had to go to high-ranking officers and try to point out to them the rights that these Marines had in terms of their religion and non-combatant status and so on. And for the most part, some of the lower ranks didn't understand that and were very difficult to deal with, but by the time you got to general ranks, most of them understood that, and so in most instances that worked out. Contrary to what is going on at the present time, in which soldiers are respected and when they come back they're saluted in the truest sense by the community. When we came back from Vietnam, we were hated. We didn't talk about it. We didn't tell anybody we'd been there. There were no celebrations. There were no marches in the streets. We were pariah. And I am glad that that has changed, because the soldiers themselves have very little to do with what goes on. And I think that they go through a lot, and to go through something like that and to not even be able to talk about it for years is a little much to ask. We had several situations in which companies went up to take the hills or the mountains around us, which were numerically numbered to their heights in meters, and some of the companies would have several hundred men in them, and we would get less than 10% back alive. So some terrible battles occurred there. And I particularly remember a situation in the hospital, which I still have major regrets to this day. A patrol had been sent outside our lines, and the officer in charge of that had actually stood up in the middle of the battle and ordered his men forward, and he basically was cut down. We actually could see this battle from where we were. It was that close. And he was brought into the aid station, or our underground hospital, and was actually still alive. And he had a dog tag on and a wedding band on the dog chain. And he asked me to take that off and put it on his finger, which I did. And then he asked me if I would tell his wife that he was okay. And then he died. And my regret about that is that in the heat of battle, and there were probably 40, 50 other casualties that day, I did not get his name or an address or anything, and never said anything to his wife. Now, whether that made any difference, it wouldn't for him, but I still remember that as an event that 40 years later is still vivid in my mind. I had a whole grouping of corpsmen with me and the other doctors that were there. And my corpsmen were being killed on such a regular basis that I got to where I could not assign them to the task. I actually passed that off to one of my underlings for him to do, because I felt that it was virtually a death sentence for most of the guys. And in the time that I was there, I don't know the exact numbers, but I would say I lost over half my corpsmen. We had sleeping quarters underground, probably about 50 feet away from the underground hospital. And the outhouses, which nobody talks about, were above ground. And you tried to be careful about moving around, and usually you went to these before dawn or after dark, so that you hoped the enemy couldn't see you from the surrounding mountains. Well, one night I had been up most of the night and had gotten to bed about 5 o'clock in the morning and trying to get a couple hours sleep. And when I woke up, it was bright, sunshiny day. And I went to the outhouse, and coming out of that, for some reason, I just had the impression I should run. So I took off running, and there were two guys behind me, and both of those guys were killed. I was knocked down and had a minor injury on my back, which I still have the flak from. And I have pictures of where that incident actually happened. And that brings into play something that I don't have very many answers for, and that is that you always ask yourself, why me, why them, and why you were preserved and they weren't. I remember one day walking around our perimeter. This was on a hill south of Khe Sanh. I thought Khe Sanh was bad, and it gets worse. And I was walking down where they had the heavy guns and tanks and stuff dug in the ground, and there was a U.S. flag that somebody was flying. And then it all comes home, what this is all about, freedom. And I have a picture of that flag that I saw out there.